Picture this, a nobleman, dressed in his finest robes, sneaking through the shadows of a medieval village, not to commit some grand act of treason, but to steal a single prized goose. It sounds almost ridiculous, doesn't it? Yet this was the reality of crime in the Middle Ages, where the line between the absurd and the deadly serious was often blurred. Justice back then wasn't just about right and wrong. It was a spectacle, a bizarre mix of superstition, social status, and downright creative cruelty. And today, we're diving headfirst into this strange world with 23 of the most outrageous crimes, and the punishments that will leave you equal parts fascinated and horrified. Medieval justice wasn't just about punishment, it was about sending a message. Imagine a time when stealing a loaf of bread could land you in the stocks, while insulting a noble might cost you your tongue, or worse. The punishments were as inventive as they were brutal, designed to humiliate, terrify, and sometimes even entertain the public. From the downright bizarre to the eerily clever, these sentences reveal how deeply law and order were tied to the beliefs and hierarchies of the time. And trust me, some of these stories are so strange, you'll wonder how they ever became part of history. But here's the thing, these crimes and punishments weren't just random acts of cruelty. They shaped societies, influenced laws, and even left traces in the way we think about justice today. So whether you're a history buff or just love a good, darkly humorous tale, stick around. We're about to uncover the weird, the wild, and the downright unbelievable side of medieval life, where every crime had a punishment, and every punishment had a story that's waited centuries to be told. Ready to step into the past? Let's begin. Bread was life in the Middle Ages, not just food, but the very foundation of survival. That's why cheating customers with shrunken loaves wasn't just dishonest, it was downright dangerous. Enter the case of the counterfeit bread, where bakers caught shortchanging their customers faced one of the most theatrical punishments of the era, the pillory. Picture a wooden frame in the bustling town square, the accused baker locked in place with the very loaves they'd tampered with dangling from their neck like a shameful necklace. Crowds would gather, jeering and throwing rotten food, turning what should have been a simple transaction into a public morality lesson. But why such harsh treatment for a few ounces of dough? Medieval societies ran on trust, especially when it came to essentials like bread. Governments even set strict price controls and weight standards, with official bread inspectors checking loaves for compliance. Getting caught meant more than a slap on the wrist. It was a betrayal of the community's survival. The pillory didn't just punish, it made an example of the offender, reinforcing that no one was above the law, not even those who held the town's dinner in their hands. What's fascinating is how this punishment mirrored the crime. Just as the baker deceived customers by hiding their dishonesty in the loaf's size, the pillory exposed their deceit for all to see. It was justice served with poetic flair, a reminder that in a world where bread could mean the difference between life and starvation, cheating the system came with consequences as heavy as the stones sometimes thrown by the crowd. Now imagine a courtroom where the defendant isn't a person, but a pig dressed in human clothes, no less. This wasn't some bizarre festival or theater performance. It was a real medieval animal trial where creatures great and small could find themselves standing before a judge. Take the case of a sow in 14th century France, accused of mauling a child to death. The pig was arrested, given a lawyer, and after a full trial, sentenced to death by hanging. But here's the strangest part. The executioners even dressed her in human garments as if to emphasize her supposed guilt. Why go through such elaborate measures for an animal? In the medieval mind, beasts weren't just mindless creatures. They were capable of moral corruption, even influenced by the devil himself. Farmers might drag locusts to court for destroying crops, or mice stand accused of theft for nibbling grain stores. Some trials even ended with animals being excommunicated, yes, formally cast out of the church as if they'd willfully chosen to sin. It sounds absurd to us now, but these proceedings reveal how deeply intertwined law, religion, and superstition were at the time. What's truly fascinating is how these trials mirrored human justice. Animals had legal representation, witnesses testified against them, and verdicts were delivered with solemn gravity. A donkey once avoided execution because witnesses swore it had lived virtuously, proof that medieval courts applied their own twisted logic to the natural world. These cases weren't just about punishment, they were about restoring divine order, as if putting a pig on trial could somehow rebalance the universe. And the punishments, they ranged from the symbolic to the brutally literal. Insects might be ordered to leave town by a certain date, while a murderous ox could be publicly executed as a warning. The message was clear: no being, human or beast, could disrupt society without consequence. It's a chilling reminder of how fear and faith shaped justice, where even the lowliest creatures could become pawns in a much larger game of morality and control. In an era when clean drinking water was scarce, ale wasn't just a beverage. It was liquid sustenance consumed by men, women, and even children with every meal. That's why dishonest brewers weren't just cheating their customers, they were playing with lives. Enter the alewife, a woman running her own brewing business, a rare chance for financial independence in medieval times, but one whose shortcuts could spell disaster. If her ale turned out sour or watered down, the punishment was as inventive as it was humiliating. She'd be strapped into the ducking stool, a wooden chair suspended over a river or pond, and plunged repeatedly into the frigid water while the town roared with laughter. This wasn't just about getting wet. The ducking stool served multiple purposes: punishment, public shaming, and a stark reminder that brewing was a matter of public health. Some towns took it further, forcing the offender to drink gallons of their own spoiled ale until they vomited, driving home the consequences of their deceit. Imagine the scene: a crowded riverbank, the alewife gasping for air between dunks, her misdeeds literally soaked into her skin as onlookers cheered. It was justice as theater, designed to brand the lesson into the community's memory. But why such extreme measures? Ale was more than a drink. It was a social contract. In a time when contaminated water could spread dysentery or cholera, a well-brewed ale was safer, thanks to the boiling process that killed bacteria. Brewers held lives in their barrels, and betraying that trust wasn't just a crime, it was a threat to the fabric of daily life. The ducking stool didn't merely punish. It restored balance, publicly cleansing the offender's reputation as surely as the water washed over them. What's striking is how these punishments targeted women in particular. While men dominated most trades, brewing was one of the few industries where women could thrive until they crossed the line. The ducking stool became a twisted equalizer, a way to police female entrepreneurs under the guise of community safety. Yet for all its cruelty, the practice revealed something profound about medieval society. When survival hinged on trust, justice had to be as visible as the crime was invisible. A bad brewer couldn't hide behind closed doors when the entire town gathered to watch their downfall. Stealing from a church wasn't just theft, it was an assault on the divine. In an age where faith shaped every aspect of life, sacred relics weren't merely objects, they were conduits to heaven, believed to hold the very power of saints and martyrs. A thief who dared to snatch a fragment of the true cross or a saint's bone wasn't just committing a crime, they were robbing a community of its spiritual lifeline. And the punishments reflected that gravity. Picture a man dragged before the town square, his right hand severed in one swift stroke, a permanent reminder that stealing from God carried consequences as eternal as the relics themselves. But why such extreme measures? Relics were more than spiritual treasures, they were economic engines. A single revered artifact could transform a humble chapel into a pilgrimage site, drawing thousands of devout travelers and their coin to a town's doors. The theft of a relic wasn't just sacrilege, it was financial sabotage. A burglar who stole a saint's finger bone wasn't just pilfering gold, they were threatening an entire town's livelihood. That's why punishments often involved branding a searing mark on the forehead or cheek, ensuring the thief would never blend into the crowd again. Every glance their way would whisper, "This one violated the sacred." The irony, some of these relics were likely fakes. Medieval Europe overflowed with enough splinters of the true cross to build a ship, and enough saintly teeth to fill a jawbreaker's nightmare. Yet belief in their power was so absolute that even dubious relics commanded reverence and ruthless protection. A thief might lose a hand for stealing a dubious scrap of cloth said to belong to the Virgin Mary, while the local lord would proudly display it, undeterred by its questionable origins. Faith, after all, moved markets as surely as it moved mountains. What's chilling is how these punishments mirrored the crime's spiritual stakes. Amputation didn't just penalize theft, it symbolically severed the thief from God's grace, just as branding marked them as outcasts in this life and the next. The message was clear: transgress against the divine, and society would make sure you carried the weight of that sin visibly, painfully, forever. It was justice designed to echo through eternity, one brutal stroke at a time. In medieval society, words weren't just words, they were weapons capable of unraveling the delicate fabric of authority. To insult a noble wasn't simply bad manners, it was an act of rebellion, a direct challenge to the rigid social order that held the world together. And the punishments reflected that peril. Picture a man dragged before his lord's court, accused of calling the baron a miser or mocking the count's lineage. His sentence, the cold bite of shears severing his tongue, not just silencing him, but transforming his body into a living warning to others. But why such brutal measures? Nobility wasn't just about wealth or power. It was divinely ordained, a sacred hierarchy stretching from heaven to earth. An insult to a lord wasn't mere gossip, it risked inspiring others to question the natural order. That's why some courts took even more inventive measures, like the dreaded sack punishment. The offender would be bound inside a heavy burlap sack, sometimes with a rooster, a dog, and a venomous snake added for poetic justice, then hurled into the deepest part of the river. The symbolism was unmistakable. Just as water erased their struggles, the community would erase their memory. The terrifying genius of these punishments lay in their theatricality. A public tongue-cutting wasn't just about mutilation. It transformed the town square into a stage where power performed its dominance. Witnesses would carry the image of that bleeding mouth back to their villages, spreading fear more effectively than any royal decree. Meanwhile, the sack punishment became a dark legend, whispered about in taverns, a story that grew taller with each retelling, reinforcing the unspoken rule: cross the nobility and you'd vanish without a trace. What's revealing is how these laws targeted not just actions but thoughts. A peasant might escape punishment for stealing bread out of hunger, but a sharp tongue could cost them everything. Speech crimes exposed medieval society's deepest fear, that words once spoken could never be unspoken. Like sparks in dry hay, they might ignite fires no sword could extinguish. So the powerful snuffed them out in the most visceral way possible, ensuring silence through scars and obedience through terror. Yet even in this brutality, cracks appeared. Some clever souls found ways to mock nobles through coded jokes or satirical plays, proving that while tongues could be cut, it was harder to suppress. The very excess of these punishments hints at an uncomfortable truth. Authority feared dissent far more than it admitted. After all, you don't sew men into sacks unless you're terrified of what they might say next. In a world where famine and disease lurked around every corner, medieval communities had no tolerance for what they saw as wasted hands. The false beggar, someone strong and healthy caught pleading for alms, wasn't just breaking the law, they were betraying the unspoken contract of survival. Picture a bustling market square where a man, muscles still firm from recent work, kneels with an outstretched bowl. When caught, the punishment was swift, the lash of a whip across his back, or worse, banishment beyond the town walls with nothing but the clothes on his back. This wasn't cruelty for its own sake. In an era without social safety nets, every pair of hands was expected to contribute. Fields needed plowing, fires needed stoking, and walls needed mending, tasks that kept the entire community from the brink. A beggar who could work but didn't was seen as a thief in disguise, stealing not just coins but the collective effort of those who labored. Towns even issued badges to the truly disabled, turning charity into a regulated system where only the deserving poor could ask for help. But here's the dark twist: many so-called false beggars weren't lazy at all. A peasant whose farm had failed or a craftsman whose trade had dried up might have no choice but to beg. The line between fraud and desperation was often blurred, yet the law showed no mercy. Some towns took humiliation further, forcing offenders to wear distinctive clothing or march through streets ringing a bell to announce their shame. The message was clear: in a world where survival was fragile, idleness was a crime against everyone. What's haunting is how these laws reveal medieval society's deepest anxieties. A single unchecked beggar could inspire others to abandon their posts, unraveling the fragile order that held hunger at bay. So punishments weren't just about justice, they were about fear. A public whipping didn't just hurt the offender, it reminded every onlooker of the cost of stepping out of line. Yet for all their severity, these laws couldn't stop the tide of human need. For every beggar chased away, two more would appear when harvests failed or winters bit too deep. The whip might keep order, but it couldn't mend the cracks in a system where one bad year could turn a farmer into a fugitive. The irony: some of history's most notorious outlaws began as false beggars, driven to desperation by laws that punished poverty rather than alleviating it. Their stories whisper a truth the Middle Ages struggled to admit. Sometimes survival itself was the greatest rebellion of all. To question the teachings of the Church in the Middle Ages wasn't just dissent, it was an existential threat, a crack in the very foundation of a society built on divine order. When someone was accused of heresy, they weren't merely breaking a law, they were unraveling the cosmic fabric that held heaven and earth together. The punishment reflected that terrifying weight, burning at the stake. But this wasn't just execution, it was theater. Flames didn't just consume the body, they were said to purify the soul, a fiery baptism meant to cleanse the world of dangerous ideas. Picture the scene: a town square packed with onlookers, the air thick with smoke and dread, as the accused stood bound to a post, their final screams drowned out by the crackling of kindling. What made heresy so feared? In an era where salvation was the ultimate concern, wrong beliefs weren't just personal choices, they were contagions capable of damning entire communities. A single heretic could lead others astray, risking divine wrath in the form of failed harvests, plagues, or wars. That's why trials often relied on spectral evidence, dreams, or forced confessions extracted under torture. Truth mattered less than perception. A whispered rumor about someone rejecting saints or doubting the sacraments could spiral into an inquisition, with neighbors turning on neighbors in a frenzy of suspicion. The cruelty of burning held a twisted logic. Fire was seen as the only force pure enough to eradicate spiritual corruption, a belief rooted in scripture and tradition. But there was another layer, the spectacle. Authorities understood that fear was their most potent tool. A public execution wasn't just about punishing one person, it was a visceral lesson for the crowd. Parents would bring children, priests would preach sermons beside the pyre, and the message was etched into every mind: stray from orthodoxy, and this would be your fate. Yet even in this darkness, defiance flickered. Some heretics, like the Cathars of southern France, went to their deaths unrepentant, singing hymns as the flames rose. Others, like the Lollards, spread their ideas in secret, proving that faith couldn't always be controlled by fear. The sheer scale of these persecutions, thousands burned across Europe, reveals not strength but panic. A system secure in its power doesn't need to light so many fires. What lingers most hauntingly is how heresy was defined. Often, it wasn't about rejecting faith entirely, but interpreting it differently, reading the Bible in one's own language, or suggesting that God's love might extend beyond the church's walls. These were crimes of imagination, punished with unimaginable pain. In the end, the smoke of those pyres carried a bitter irony. The louder the authorities insisted on unity, the more they exposed the fractures beneath the surface. The flames sought to erase dissent, but they also illuminated the unstoppable human hunger to question, to wonder, and to seek truth even when the cost was ash. The forests of medieval Europe weren't just clusters of trees. They were royal treasure chests, bursting with deer, boar, and other prized game reserved exclusively for nobility. To hunt there without permission wasn't merely theft, it was an act of defiance against the king himself. Picture a peasant setting snares in the moonlit woods, hoping to feed his starving family, only to be caught by the foresters. His punishment, not a fine or a night in jail, but the searing pain of a hot iron pressed to his eyes, blinding him forever for daring to touch what belonged to the crown. Why such extreme measures? Hunting rights weren't about sport or even food. They were symbols of power. William the Conqueror had established vast royal forests across England, declaring them off-limits to commoners under pain of mutilation or death. These weren't empty threats. Records show poachers hanged from gibbets at forest boundaries, their bodies left to rot as warnings. The message was clear: wild game belonged to the elite by divine right, and taking even a single rabbit was tantamount to stealing from God's anointed ruler. But here's the cruel twist: many poachers weren't rebels or outlaws, they were desperate. In winters when crops failed, venison might mean the difference between life and starvation for a village. Some turned to hunting just to pay crushing taxes imposed by the very lords who barred them from the woods. The law showed no mercy. One 13th century statute decreed that any commoner caught with hunting dogs near royal forests would have 3 toes chopped off, ensuring they could never again pursue game, even if they somehow escaped the noose. The enforcement of these laws revealed the era's brutal class divide. Noblemen hunted freely, their falcons and hounds celebrated in tapestries and songs, while peasants faced torture for setting simple traps. Forest courts operated with terrifying efficiency, employing teams of armed wardens who patrolled the greenwood like soldiers guarding a castle. Their word was law, no jury, no appeal. A forester's accusation was often enough to send a man swinging from the gallows oak. Yet resistance simmered beneath the surface. Folktales celebrated rogue hunters like Robin Hood, who stole the king's deer to feed the poor. Real-life poachers became folk heroes, using camouflaged pits and silent arrows to outwit the wardens. The very excess of the punishments hints at how widespread the problem was. You don't blind dozens of men unless the forests are crawling with defiant hunters. What lingers most hauntingly is how these laws shaped the landscape itself. Vast swaths of farmland were cleared to create hunting grounds, displacing villages to satisfy noble whims. The wild creatures within became more valued than the people outside. In the end, the true crime wasn't the taking of game, it was a system that prized a stag's life over a peasant's sight, and a king's pride over a family's survival. The forests may have teemed with life, but their shadows hid some of medieval justice's darkest contradictions. Marriage in the Middle Ages wasn't just a promise between two people, it was the glue holding families, lands, and even political alliances together. When adultery shattered that bond, it wasn't merely a personal betrayal but a seismic threat to the social order. That's why punishments for unfaithful spouses weren't quiet or private. They were spectacular displays of humiliation designed to stitch the fabric of community back together. Picture a woman or man stripped bare, forced to march through the jeering crowd, their shame as exposed as their skin. Some towns took it further, locking offenders in stocks with placards detailing their sins, or even shaving their heads to mark them as moral outcasts. The deeper logic behind these punishments reveals how medieval minds viewed marriage. A wedding wasn't just a romantic union, it was a sacred vow before God and a binding economic contract between families. Adultery didn't just break hearts, it risked inheritance disputes, illegitimate heirs, and even violence between clans. A lord whose wife strayed might see his lands contested, while a merchant's unfaithful spouse could destabilize carefully negotiated business ties. Public shaming wasn't just about revenge, it was a reset button, a way to visibly cleanse the dishonor and reassure the community that balance had been restored. But the cruelty often fell hardest on women. While male adulterers faced scorn, wives frequently endured harsher penalties, double standards rooted in fears about paternity. A man's infidelity might be dismissed as a lapse, but a woman's could cast doubt on the lineage of entire noble houses. Some courts even mandated distinctive clothing for convicted adulteresses, like striped hoods or scarlet gowns, turning them into walking cautionary tales. The message was clear: female virtue wasn't just personal, it was communal property, policed with brutal creativity. Yet even in this rigid system, cracks appeared. Satirical poems and bawdy tales from the era are full of clever wives outwitting jealous husbands, hinting that real-life adultery was far more common than records suggest. Church courts sometimes offered surprising leniency, ordering wayward spouses to perform pilgrimages rather than face mutilation. And in rare cases, communities rallied around the accused, especially if the aggrieved husband was widely disliked. The gap between law and practice whispers an uncomfortable truth. For all the grand spectacle of punishment, human desire proved harder to control than any medieval magistrate imagined. What lingers most isn't just the brutality, but the paradox at its core. These punishments sought to protect marriage by tearing people apart, using isolation to reinforce unity, shame to restore honor. In the end, the naked parades and scarlet hoods exposed more than sinners. They laid bare a society so terrified of chaos that it would rather brand its wounds than heal them. And somewhere beneath the jeers and the placards, the human heart kept beating untamed, unpredictable, and utterly indifferent to the stocks, a whisper in the dark. A child's sudden fever, a cow's milk gone sour overnight. In the Middle Ages, these weren't just misfortunes, they were potential signs of a witch's curse, and the accusations that followed could turn a neighbor into a nightmare. Witchcraft trials weren't about evidence as we understand it today. They were about fear, and the punishments reflected that terror in ways that still chill the blood. Imagine a woman, often elderly or socially isolated, dragged before a tribunal where her fate rested not on facts but on impossible tests. Walk across these red-hot plowshares. If your feet remain unburned, God has spared you. If not, the flames await. The logic was as cruel as it was circular. Trials by ordeal placed the accused in no-win scenarios. Dunking tests, where a suspected witch was bound and thrown into water, operated on the belief that purity would make her sink. If she floated proof of the devil's intervention, she'd be hauled out only to face execution. These spectacles weren't just about guilt or innocence. They were rituals to purge communities of unseen evil. When harvests failed or disease spread, witchcraft accusations offered an explanation and a scapegoat. Yet the true horror lay in how ordinary these persecutions became. Records from towns like Bamberg in Germany reveal mass trials where hundreds perished, their confessions extracted through sleep deprivation, thumb screws, and the crushing weight of isolation. Panic spread like wildfire, with children accusing parents and friends turning on friends. The line between victim and accuser blurred as torture twisted truth into whatever narrative would end the pain. What's often overlooked is who bore the brunt of these hunts: midwives, healers, or women who simply didn't conform. Outsiders made easy targets. A knowledge of herbs could mark someone as a potion brewer. A quarrel over borrowed milk might spiral into allegations of hexes. The punishments, from burning to pressing beneath stones, weren't just deaths, they were warnings. A witch's execution drew crowds not because people reveled in suffering, but because it promised safety, a way to regain control in a world where misfortune felt like malice. The legacy of these trials lingers in unsettling ways. Modern forensic analysis shows some accused witches bore physical deformities, bony growths, or extra nipples that inquisitors called devil's marks. These were likely natural variations, but in an era without science, difference equaled danger. The witch hunts reveal less about magic than about human nature, our need to explain the inexplicable, and our willingness to sacrifice the vulnerable for the illusion of order. In the end, the flames consumed more than lives. They burned away trust, leaving scars on communities that sometimes took generations to heal. The tragedy wasn't just the innocent who died, but the societies that convinced themselves such cruelty was justice. When fear becomes law, the real witchcraft is the spell it casts on us all, the belief that safety lies in another's suffering. In a world without refrigeration or supermarkets, a stolen cow or sheep wasn't just property loss, it could mean starvation for an entire family. That's why medieval courts treated livestock theft with ruthless severity. Picture a thief caught leading a neighbor's ox into the night. His punishment wasn't just a fine or jail time, but the searing pain of a hot iron pressed into his cheek, leaving a permanent mark for all to see. Some regions took it further, amputating the hand that committed the crime, ensuring the offender would never again grasp another man's livelihood. The branding iron served a dual purpose. Beyond the immediate agony, it transformed the thief into a walking warning. A branded face couldn't blend into crowds at marketplaces or seek work in distant villages. The mark carried its own economy of shame. Employers would turn branded men away, innkeepers might refuse them lodging, and even churches sometimes barred them from communion. It was punishment that kept punishing long after the wound had healed. But why such extreme measures? A single cow represented months of labor, plowing fields, producing milk, even providing leather and glue in death. For smallholders, losing livestock could trigger a downward spiral into debt or servitude. Records from English manors show families mortgaging future harvests just to replace a stolen pig. The law recognized this fragility. While stealing a noble's silver might earn a whipping, taking a peasant's goat could cost you your hand. the punishment mirrored the crime's social impact, harsher for those least able to absorb the loss. The irony, many so-called thieves were desperate neighbors themselves. Harsh winters or failed crops might drive otherwise honest peasants to snatch a chicken or lamb. Courts showed little mercy. One 14th century case describes a man losing his right hand for stealing 2 ducks, his defense of starving children ignored. The message was clear: survival wasn't an excuse. What's revealing is how these laws protected not just property, but the social order. A branded thief became a visible boundary between lawful and lawless, reinforcing that certain lines couldn't be crossed, no matter how empty one's belly. Yet the very brutality of these punishments hints at their imperfect effectiveness. You don't chop off hands unless theft is rampant. For all their severity, the laws couldn't erase the truth that hunger makes its own justice. The legacy lingers in unexpected ways. Modern idioms like "caught red-handed" trace back to livestock theft, where blood on a suspect's hands was damning evidence. And those rustling laws, they evolved into today's property protections, proof that while the branding irons are gone, the fear of losing what keeps us alive still shapes the law's long memory. Marketplaces in the Middle Ages were more than just shopping centers. They were the beating heart of community life, where trust between buyer and seller meant the difference between prosperity and ruin. That's why cheating merchants faced punishments designed to strike at the very core of their deception, their reputation. Picture a cloth seller caught diluting expensive dyes with chalk, or a butcher adding stones to his scales to inflate prices. His sentence, a humiliating spectacle where the offending goods became his shackles. In some towns, dishonest traders were nailed to their own market stalls by the ear, literally pinned to the scene of their crimes as crowds jeered. Others were forced to wear their tainted wares like badges of shame. A baker with moldy bread strung around his neck, or a fishmonger draped in spoiled herring, the stench announcing his guilt long before he reached the stocks. The genius of these punishments lay in their symbolism. Just as the merchant had betrayed the public's trust in secret, their penalty unfolded in brutal daylight. Nailing someone by the ear wasn't just about pain. It was a physical tether to their deceit, ensuring they couldn't turn away from the consequences. Forced to stand for hours in the elements, the offender became part of the market's architecture, a living reminder that fraud wouldn't be tolerated. And the crowds weren't just passive observers, they were active participants in the justice. Rotting food, mud, and insults rained down, turning the punishment into a communal reckoning. But why such theatrical cruelty? Medieval commerce operated on a razor's edge. Without standardized weights, quality controls, or consumer protections, every transaction relied on honor. A single bad actor could poison an entire town's economy. Records from London's Guildhall reveal cases where entire merchant guilds imposed these punishments on their own members, not out of spite, but to preserve hard-won public confidence. A guild that policed itself harshly gained trust, and trust meant business. The punishments also exposed a fascinating class divide. While nobles might duel over insults, merchants fought with ledgers and reputations. A tarnished name could bankrupt a family for generations. Some cheating traders preferred losing an ear to the nail rather than facing lifelong exile from the marketplace. Yet the system wasn't entirely merciless. Accounts from German towns describe first-time offenders released after a few hours, ears intact but pride shattered provided they swore oaths to reform. Repeat culprits, however, faced permanent marks, cropped ears, branded cheeks, or even banishment beyond the city gates. What's haunting is how modern these struggles feel. Replace the pillory with online reviews, and the medieval fear of fraud mirrors our own. The stalls may have evolved into digital storefronts, but the core tension remains. Commerce thrives on trust, and trust is fragile. Those nailed to their stalls centuries ago weren't just paying for their crimes, they were sacrificial lessons in an economic truth as old as trade itself. Cheat your customers and sooner or later, the market will pin you where everyone can see. Deserting the battlefield in the Middle Ages wasn't just an act of cowardice, it was treason against your brothers in arms, your lord, and the very idea of sacred honor that held armies together. Imagine the chaos of a medieval melee where one soldier's panic could trigger a rout, dooming hundreds to slaughter. For that moment of weakness, the punishment was as merciless as war itself. Deserters might find themselves pinned beneath a massive wooden board, slowly crushed under the weight of stones as their comrades watched. Others were buried alive up to their necks near camp, left to starve as a grisly reminder of the cost of betrayal. These weren't arbitrary acts of cruelty, they were calculated psychological warfare. Medieval commanders understood that survival instinct often overpowered loyalty, especially among conscripted peasants who'd rather be tilling fields than facing arrows. The threat of public, agonizing death became the glue holding shaky alliances together. Records from the 100 Years' War describe entire units forced to witness a deserter's execution before battle. The message clear: stand and fight, or die more horribly than the enemy could ever devise. Yet hidden beneath this brutality lay a fascinating contradiction. While common soldiers faced burial alive, knights occasionally received startling leniency, allowed to ransom themselves after fleeing. The disparity exposed medieval war's unspoken hierarchy. A nobleman's life had monetary and political value, while a foot soldier was expendable. Some armies even institutionalized this double standard. The Venetian navy chained deserters to their oars, turning them into permanent galley slaves, while French commanders sometimes branded runaways with hot irons shaped like fleurs de lis, marking them as cowards in perpetuity. What's most chilling is how these punishments mirrored the crime's consequences. Just as desertion left a hole in the battle line, burial alive literally erased the offender from the world. Crushing mimicked the suffocating pressure of a collapsing shield wall. The punishments weren't just retribution, they were dark poetry, making abstract betrayal viscerally real. But even terror had its limits. Chronicles from the Crusades reveal mass desertions during sieges, where thirst and disease outweighed fear of punishment. Some commanders, recognizing this, began offering pardons to deserters who returned, proof that medieval justice sometimes bent to pragmatism. The buried and the crushed became warnings, but also admissions. No punishment could truly conquer fear. In the end, these brutal measures reveal less about cowardice than about war's essential paradox: men forced to be brave by the very terror they fled. In a world where every misfortune, from drought to disease, could be seen as divine punishment, uttering curses against God or the saints wasn't just crude language, it was an act of social arson. Picture a man in a moment of rage, railing against heaven after his crops failed, only to find himself dragged before the local bishop. His sentence: a needle and thread piercing his lips together, sealing his blasphemies inside forever. This wasn't merely about pain, it was symbolic justice, stitching the offender's mouth as if repairing a tear in the fabric of faith itself. The medieval mind saw blasphemy as uniquely dangerous. Unlike theft or assault, which harmed individuals, cursing God risked bringing wrath upon the entire community. Chronicles from plague years describe townspeople accusing blasphemers of inviting the pestilence, their words like sparks in a tinderbox of divine anger. That's why some courts ordered exile, casting the offender beyond the village boundaries, as if their very presence had become a contagion. To medieval Christians, silence wasn't just punishment, it was quarantine for the soul. Yet the methods varied chillingly by region. In Venice, blasphemers might be gagged with iron bridles resembling horse bits, a humiliating reminder that their words had reduced them to beasts. Spanish Inquisition records detailed tongues nailed to posts for repeat offenders, while French towns occasionally employed a ghastly inversion, forcing the guilty to bite down on a hot iron, branding their sin into the flesh that formed the words. Each technique shared a common thread, transforming the mouth, the instrument of offense, into its own prison. What's often overlooked is who bore the brunt of these laws. Day laborers, soldiers, and sailors, men whose rough trades bred rough speech, appear most frequently in trial records. A nobleman's oath might be dismissed as a bad habit, but a drunk peasant cursing St. Peter during a tavern brawl could lose his lips. The disparity reveals how blasphemy laws policed class as much as piety, ensuring the marginalized stayed mindful of their place in God's and society's hierarchy. The true power of these punishments lay in their lingering shame. A man with sewn lips couldn't work, eat, or pray without visible reminder of his transgression. Neighbors would cross themselves at his approach, children point and whisper. Exile was even more final, cut off from community. The blasphemer became a ghost in life, denied the sacraments that promised salvation. In a world where identity was rooted in belonging, this was a fate worse than flames. Yet whispers of resistance persisted. Folktales tell of cunning heretics who wrote their heresies on parchment and swallowed them, or minstrels who mocked the clergy through coded lyrics. The very excess of the punishments hints at their imperfect effectiveness. You don't nail tongues to posts unless blasphemy remains stubbornly common. For all their brutality, the sewers and gags couldn't silence the human impulse to rage against the heavens when life grew unbearable. What lingers most is the paradox. A faith built on sacred words feared certain words enough to destroy the mouths that spoke them. The lips stitched shut in market squares weren't just silenced, they were monuments to a desperate truth. Even in an age of absolute belief, doubt and anger simmered beneath the surface, and no needle could ever fully mend that tear. In an era when literacy was rare and legal documents carried the weight of holy scripture, forging a land deed or royal charter wasn't just fraud, it was an assault on the very pillars of power. Picture a scribe hunched over parchment by candlelight, carefully replicating a noble's seal or mimicking a bishop's signature. If caught, his punishment struck at the heart of his crime. The fingers that crafted the deception would be systematically broken, joint by joint, or severed entirely with a blacksmith's pincers. Some courts took poetic justice further, forcing the forger to press his inked fingertips onto a confession, creating a grotesque final signature before the blade fell. The brutality of these punishments reveals how profoundly medieval society relied on written words. As kingdoms grew beyond face-to-face rule, documents became proxies for authority. A signed charter could transfer forests, levy taxes, or even declare war. A single skilled forger might append generations of inheritance or drain a monastery's coffers with fake debt notes. That's why the laws targeted not just the act, but the very ability to repeat it. A scribe without fingers was like a swordsman without arms. His dangerous skills neutralized permanently. Records from English courts describe convicted forgers being paraded through towns with their ruined hands displayed on wooden trays, turning their mutilation into a public service announcement about the cost of deception. But here's the macabre twist. Some forgers were respected professionals pushed to desperation. A clerk drowning in gambling debts might alter a will for quick coin, or a minor noble could fabricate lineage documents to claim ancestral land. The line between cunning and crime was often blurred, especially when forgery benefited those in power. One infamous case involved a French notary who created fake titles for his lord, only to have his fingers chopped off when the scheme unraveled. The Lord, he walked away with a slap on the wrist, proving that justice tilted heavily toward the privileged. The methods of detection were as creative as the crimes themselves. Suspect documents might be held to candlelight to reveal erased text, or compared against wax seal fragments like medieval forensic evidence. Some courts employed script doctors, experts who could spot inconsistencies in handwriting the way a modern analyst might detect counterfeit bills. When guilt was proven, the punishment ritual itself became a perverse art form. In German towns, forgers sometimes had their offending hand nailed to the courtroom door before amputation, a grisly guarantee that no one would forget the consequences. What's haunting is how these mutilations mirrored society's deepest anxieties. As parchment replaced spoken oaths, people feared the written word's vulnerability. A severed finger wasn't just retribution, it was a symbolic restoration of trust, a bloody reassurance that the system could still police itself. Yet for all their severity, the laws couldn't stamp out forgery entirely. Secretaries continued to tweak documents for patrons. Monks discovered convenient old charters to strengthen abbey claims, and desperate souls risked their hands for one life-changing deception. The legacy of these punishments lingers in unexpected ways. Modern phrases like "getting caught red-handed" may trace back to forgery trials where ink-stained fingers were damning evidence. And those medieval fears about document integrity, they birthed the intricate seals, watermarks, and notary systems that evolved into today's cybersecurity measures. The broken fingers of long-dead scribes whisper a timeless warning: trust is fragile, and society will go to brutal lengths to protect it. In the tightly knit villages of medieval Europe, hiding a fugitive wasn't just an act of kindness, it was a gamble with your own neck. The law saw no distinction between the outlaw and those who gave them bread or shelter. A family offering a night's refuge to a hunted thief could find themselves standing beside him on the gallows, their home burned to the ground as a warning to others. This wasn't just justice, it was psychological warfare, turning every neighbor into a potential informant and every cottage into a trap for the desperate. The logic behind these collective punishments was brutally simple. In a world without professional police forces, authorities relied on fear to keep communities self-policing. A village that harbored a criminal became complicit in their crimes, so entire populations were incentivized to turn in strangers or even longtime neighbors at the slightest whisper of suspicion. Records from English court rolls describe cases where whole families were imprisoned because one member sheltered a poacher, their land confiscated, and their names tainted for generations. The message was clear: loyalty to the law trumped blood ties or mercy, but the system's true cruelty lay in its contradictions. The same medieval ballads that celebrated Robin Hood's band of outlaws also praised villages that betrayed runaways to the sheriff. Survival often meant choosing between morality and self-preservation. In some regions, harboring a fugitive could lead to the hue and cry, a legal obligation for all able-bodied villagers to chase down the offender. Refusing to join the mob made you suspect, yet participating might mean hunting someone you knew was innocent. The law created impossible choices, binding communities in webs of mutual suspicion. What's fascinating is how these practices shaped social dynamics. Tavern keepers became unofficial spies, watching for unfamiliar faces. Travelers without proper papers might be turned away at the town gates, not out of malice, but because no one dared risk the consequences of welcoming the wrong stranger. Even acts of charity became dangerous. A loaf of bread given to a starving wanderer could be construed as aiding a criminal. The fear of collective punishment didn't just enforce the law, it rewired human relationships, replacing trust with calculation. Yet resistance flickered in unexpected ways. Folktales tell of priests who hid wanted men in church crypts or farmers who smuggled fugitives out in hay carts. Some villages developed elaborate warning systems, a certain candle in the window, a coded knock, to protect their own while maintaining plausible deniability. The very excess of the punishments hints at their imperfect effectiveness. You don't burn entire households unless people keep defying the rules. The legacy of these laws lingers in modern legal concepts like aiding and abetting, but their deeper imprint is cultural. They forced medieval society to grapple with a haunting question: is justice served when fear becomes the glue holding communities together? The gallows may have claimed the bodies of outlaws and their helpers, but the real casualty was something far harder to restore: the belief that a neighbor's door might open in compassion rather than betrayal. Imagine the terror of watching flames engulf your neighbor's home, knowing the fire could leap to your own roof within moments. In medieval towns where tightly packed wooden buildings stood like kindling waiting for a spark, arson wasn't just destruction, it was mass murder in slow motion. That's why setting fires, even by accident, carried a punishment as merciless as the crime itself. The arsonist would be burned alive at the very spot they ignited. This wasn't mere retribution, it was a ghastly reenactment, forcing the offender to experience the horror they'd inflicted on others. The symmetry of this punishment reveals how deeply medieval society feared fire's chaos. A single spark could erase entire blocks, leaving families homeless and livelihoods reduced to ash. Chronicles from London describe the Great Fire of 1281, where flames swallowed over 100 homes in hours. Disasters like these etched trauma into collective memory. Courts treated arsonists as domestic terrorists, their crimes akin to poisoning wells or betraying city gates to an enemy. Even negligence carried brutal consequences. A baker who let his oven embers escape might lose his shop. If lives were lost, he could find himself tied to the pyre beside professional fire setters. Yet the legal response was as layered as it was vicious. Some towns distinguished between malicious arson and tragic accidents, offering first-time offenders the chance to pay massive fines instead of facing flames. But for repeat offenders or those targeting churches or noble estates, no mercy existed. Trial records from Germany describe arsonists being paraded through streets with their hands bound in wax-soaked gloves, crude replicas of their crimes before execution. The message was clear: fire was the community's shared vulnerability, and anyone who weaponized it became something less than human. What's chilling is how these executions doubled as fire prevention theater. Crowds gathered not just for spectacle but to internalize the lesson. Parents brought children, pointing as the flames climbed the condemned's body, whispering, "This is what happens when you play with fire." The ritual transformed justice into a visceral vaccination against carelessness, a warning seared into memory more effectively than any sermon or law scroll. But beneath the brutality lay a haunting irony. Many so-called arsonists were victims themselves, servants forced to take blame for a master's negligence, or mentally ill individuals who couldn't comprehend their actions. One French case recounts a homeless man executed for setting a haystack ablaze to keep warm, his desperation outweighing the risk. The law showed no nuance. Fire demanded fire, regardless of intent. The legacy of these punishments flickers in modern fire codes and insurance systems, born from medieval attempts to control the uncontrollable. Those public burnings were more than cruelty. They were a society's frantic attempt to tame the one element that could reduce its order to ashes in minutes. In the end, the flames consumed not just the guilty, but the illusion that any punishment could truly extinguish fear. Fire remained king, and humanity its uneasy subject. In the medieval world, where a single bad harvest could plunge a family into debt for generations, lending money at high interest wasn't just business, it was seen as a sin against God and neighbor. The Church's condemnation of usury went far beyond disapproval. It branded moneylenders as moral pariahs, unworthy of Christian burial or community respect. Picture a wealthy merchant dragged through the streets, his ledgers tied around his neck like a millstone, while the town crier announced his crimes. His punishment, public flogging, not just for greed, but for poisoning the very bonds that held society together. This wasn't mere hypocrisy. It reflected a profound medieval belief that economics couldn't be separated from morality. Charging interest, especially to the desperate, was considered a form of theft from God's created order. Theologians like Thomas Aquinas argued that money itself was barren. It couldn't naturally reproduce like crops or livestock. Profiting from loans was therefore unnatural, a perversion of divine law. Records from Italian city-states revealed debtors' prisons filled with starving artisans while their creditors faced excommunication, a stark contradiction that exposed the system's tensions. Yet the reality was far messier than church doctrine suggested. As trade expanded, even monasteries quietly engaged in lending, disguising interest as gifts or fees. Jewish moneylenders, barred from many professions, filled the gap, a tragic irony that made them both essential and scapegoats. When debts mounted, pogroms often followed, proving how easily spiritual ideals could twist into violence. The whip and the denied funeral weren't just punishments. They were pressure valves for societal guilt over an economy that couldn't function without the very sin it condemned. What's fascinating is how these medieval debates echo today. Modern credit card interest rates would have shocked Aquinas, yet we still wrestle with the same core question: when does profit cross into exploitation? The whippings are gone, but the shame lingers in words like loan shark or predatory lending. The past whispers a warning we've yet to fully heed, that financial systems built on desperation eventually demand their pound of flesh, whether in coin or conscience. In the tightly ordered world of medieval society, kidnapping wasn't just theft, it was a violation of the sacred bonds that held communities together. To snatch a child from their home or drag a traveler into the night wasn't merely a crime against one person, it shattered the collective sense of safety. That's why punishments for abductors were as visceral as the trauma they inflicted. Picture a kidnapper thrown into a freshly dug pit, the earth shoveled over them until only their pleading face remained visible, a living grave mirroring the disappearance they'd orchestrated. In some regions, stones were piled atop the condemned in a grotesque reenactment of their own brutality, their last breaths crushed out by the weight of justice itself. The sheer horror of these methods reveals how medieval law viewed kidnapping. Unlike stolen livestock or goods, a person couldn't be replaced. A noble's kidnapped heir might spark wars over succession, while a peasant's lost child meant not just grief but the ruin of a family's labor force. Records from German towns describe cases where abductors were sealed inside barrels, studded with nails and rolled downhill, each agonizing rotation symbolizing the irreversible damage they'd caused. The punishment wasn't just about pain, it was existential poetry, forcing the criminal to experience the helplessness they'd imposed on their victim. But here's the grim irony: while kidnapping commoners brought horrific penalties, the law often turned a blind eye when the powerful did the same. Lords occasionally recruited skilled craftsmen by force, and press gangs swept through ports to fill ships' crews. The buried alive sentence was reserved for those without patronage, proof that medieval justice, for all its theatrical cruelty, still bent to privilege. What lingers most hauntingly is how these punishments targeted the imagination as much as the body. A public burial or crushing didn't just kill the offender, it seared the consequences into the minds of witnesses. Parents could point to the half-covered face in the pit and whisper, "This is what happens to those who steal children." The message was primal: violate the bonds of community, and the community would erase you from the world. Yet beneath the spectacle lay a deeper truth: no punishment, no matter how brutal, could ever fully restore what was lost. The stones might settle, the earth might smooth over, but the absence would remain, a silent verdict on justice's limits. In a world without forensic science or video evidence, medieval courts relied on sworn testimony as the bedrock of justice, which meant a single lie could send an innocent man to the gallows or let a murderer walk free. That's why perjury wasn't just dishonesty. It was an attack on the entire system, punishable by mutilations designed to match the crime's gravity. Imagine a witness caught fabricating testimony against a neighbor. The sentence wasn't a fine or jail time, but the cold slice of a blade severing their tongue, the very organ that had betrayed the truth. Some courts opted for branding, searing the letter L for liar into the forehead, ensuring every handshake and marketplace encounter would carry the weight of that deception forever. The brutality of these punishments reveals how deeply medieval society revered truth-telling. Oaths weren't mere formalities, they were sacred bonds, sworn on relics or Bibles believed to hold supernatural power. A false witness didn't just mislead a jury, they risked divine wrath upon the community. Records from English courts describe cases where entire trials were overturned because a single perjurer's lies came to light, leaving judges desperate to restore faith in the system. The mutilations served a dual purpose, punishing the individual while deterring others from gambling with the truth, but the methods varied chillingly by region. In some German towns, perjurers were forced to hold red-hot irons in their mouths, literally sealing their capacity for further deceit. Venetian courts sometimes nailed the offender's tongue to a post in the public square, leaving them to choose between tearing free or remaining trapped, a grotesque metaphor for the inescapable consequences of lies. The branding iron was particularly insidious. Unlike stolen goods or violent crimes, perjury left no visible scars on its victims, so the law imposed a visible mark on its perpetrators. A branded forehead transformed the liar into a walking cautionary tale, someone forever excluded from testifying or even participating in civic life. What's often overlooked is how these laws targeted power dynamics. Wealthy accusers could sometimes bribe or intimidate witnesses into false testimony, knowing the poor had fewer means to defend themselves. When the truth emerged, however, the witness, not the manipulator, faced mutilation. One heartbreaking case from 14th century France involves a peasant woman whose coerced testimony sent a man to the gallows. When her perjury was discovered, her tongue was cut out, while the nobleman who'd threatened her escaped with a fine. The law's asymmetry exposed a painful truth. Justice might punish lies, but it rarely punished the powerful who orchestrated them. Yet even in this darkness, glimmers of nuance appeared. Ecclesiastical courts occasionally showed leniency to those who confessed under duress, ordering pilgrimages instead of mutilation. Some towns implemented oath helpers, groups of reputable citizens who would swear to a witness's character, offering a fragile shield against false accusations. The very excess of the punishments hints at their imperfect effectiveness. You don't brand foreheads unless perjury remains a stubborn problem. The legacy of these laws lingers in modern symbols like the scales of justice or the witness's raised hand, rituals still steeped in medieval reverence for truth. But the severed tongues and branded brows whisper a darker lesson. When a society's justice system hangs on words alone, it will go to brutal lengths to sanctify them. The mutilations weren't just about retribution. They were desperate attempts to carve certainty into an uncertain world, one irreversible mark at a time. In the cramped, pungent lanes of a medieval marketplace, the butcher's stall wasn't just a shop. It was a lifeline. Families depended on his honesty, trusting that the meat they carried home wouldn't poison their children or spark deadly outbreaks. That's why selling rotten meat wasn't just fraud. It was a betrayal of the most visceral kind, punishable by equally visceral justice. Picture a butcher caught passing off spoiled pork as fresh, dragged through the mud behind a snorting horse, his own tainted goods tied around his neck like a grotesque necklace. The streets would fill with jeers as the stench of decay mingled with the rising dust, a public rebuke so humiliating it bordered on ritual cleansing. The sheer theatricality of this punishment reveals how deeply medieval society feared foodborne illness. Without refrigeration or germ theory, spoiled meat was a silent killer, capable of wiping out entire households before anyone understood why. Town records from York describe outbreaks of bloody flux traced back to rancid beef, leaving authorities desperate to deter reckless butchers. Some courts took the humiliation further, locking offenders in stocks with slabs of their own rotten meat pinned to their clothing, forcing them to endure the flies and stench until the crowd's anger subsided. The message was unmistakable. You forced the community to risk death for profit. Now you'll wallow in the consequences. But the cruelty masked a fascinating legal nuance. Butchers' guilds often policed their own members, imposing these punishments before secular authorities could intervene. A guild that rooted out rot quickly earned public trust, and trust meant business. In Nuremberg, master butchers inspected stalls weekly, tossing spoiled cuts into the street while fining the offender. Repeat violators faced expulsion, losing their right to trade entirely. This self-regulation wasn't altruism, it was survival. A single tainted sausage could tarnish a town's reputation for years, driving travelers to rival markets. The punishments also exposed medieval hypocrisy. While a poor butcher might be flogged for selling slightly off mutton, wealthy merchants occasionally smuggled spoiled goods to armies or workhouses where complaints could be ignored. One infamously corrupt London supplier escaped punishment by selling rotten beef to a prison, arguing successfully that inmates lacked the refinement to taste the difference. The law's uneven application proved that food safety, like so much else, tilted on the scales of class. What lingers most is how these spectacles mirrored the crime's intimacy. A tailor's shoddy stitch might ruin a coat, but a butcher's deceit could end lives. The dragging, the stocks, the rotting meat, all forced the offender to confront the physical reality of their betrayal. In an era before health inspectors or expiration dates, justice had to be as immediate and unmistakable as the gag reflex from a mouthful of spoiled venison. The streets might eventually be scrubbed clean, but no one who'd seen a butcher humiliated would forget the cost of playing games with hunger. In the solemn hush of Lent, when medieval streets were meant to echo with prayers rather than laughter, the rhythmic stamp of dancing feet wasn't just frivolous, it was heresy in motion. Picture a group of villagers stealing away to a barn as the fasting season began, their bodies swaying to forbidden tunes while the priest's warnings still hung in the air. If caught, their punishment was as swift as it was symbolic, stripped to the waist and flogged in the churchyard, their backs crisscrossed with welts mirroring the stripes of Christ's own scourging. This wasn't merely about discipline, it was a brutal reminder that even joy had its proper place under the watchful eye of the church. The crackdown on dancing reveals how deeply religious authorities sought to control time itself. Lent wasn't just a period of abstinence, it was a spiritual battlefield where every suppressed desire strengthened the soul. Dancing, with its unchecked physicality and potential for revelry, threatened to unravel that sacred tension. Records from French parishes describe fines levied on entire families when their children were caught frolicking during the 40-day fast. In some German towns, offenders were forced to stand barefoot on frozen church steps for hours, their shivering bodies a living sermon on the consequences of misplaced mirth. But beneath the surface, these punishments exposed a tug of war between doctrine and human nature. Folk traditions stubbornly persisted, with clandestine dances held in cellars or remote fields. Some communities developed coded gestures, a subtle hand clap or foot tap, to skirt the rules while technically remaining still. The Church's obsession with policing movement hints at a deeper fear. If people could defy Lent's austerity in something as simple as dance, what larger rebellions might follow? The class divide in enforcement was particularly striking. Nobles often hosted quiet musical evenings during Lent, their wealth insulating them from consequences, while peasants faced the lash for similar indulgences. A bishop might pardon a knight's festive banquet as a private devotion, yet a farmer's daughter caught spinning in rhythm with friends could be branded a temptress. The hypocrisy wasn't lost on the masses' ballads from the era mock clergymen who preached abstinence by day but feasted behind monastery walls by night. What's haunting is how these puritanical measures birthed unexpected creativity. Forbidden dances evolved into intricate, almost ritualistic forms, their very illegality lending them power. The flogging scars some bore became badges of quiet resistance, proof that not all souls could be subdued by the calendar. By the late Middle Ages, certain regions saw the rise of Lenten jesters, performers who exaggerated the era's dourness through parody, their exaggerated solemnity a wink to audiences weary of enforced piety. The legacy of these bans lingers in modern carnival traditions, where pre-Lent celebrations explode with deliberate excess, as if centuries of pent-up motion finally breaks free. Those long-ago villagers dancing in shadowed barns might not have realized it, but their defiance was its own kind of faith, a belief that the body's joy could be as sacred as the soul's repentance. The Church sought to divide the year into neat categories of sacred and profane, but humanity, as always, danced to a rhythm all its own. To disturb the dead in medieval Europe wasn't just theft, it was an assault on the boundary between this world and the next. Grave robbers who pried open coffins for rings or shrouds didn't merely steal objects, they violated the sacred journey of the soul, risking divine wrath that could blight entire communities. That's why their punishments were so chillingly poetic. A thief caught plundering a tomb might find himself sealed inside one, buried alive beside the very bones he'd disrespected. Others were hanged in iron cages directly above the desecrated grave, their decaying bodies left to swing as eternal sentinels against further sacrilege, a grotesque mirror of the crime that forced them to keep company with the dead they'd wronged. The terror of grave robbing went beyond superstition. In an era when Christian doctrine taught that bodies would literally rise on Judgment Day, disturbing a corpse wasn't just disrespectful, it was sabotage against the deceased's chance at resurrection. Records from English church courts describe cases where robbers were forced to wear the stolen shrouds like macabre tunics as they were paraded to execution, their flesh pressed against the fabric meant for another's eternity. Some towns took the symbolism further, nailing the thief's hands to the cemetery gates, the tools of his crime immobilized at the threshold between the living and the dead. But the darkest irony lay in who often filled these graves prematurely. Medical schools and anatomists quietly paid top coin for fresh corpses, creating a shadow market that tempted the desperate. A poor laborer might risk eternal damnation by night to feed his family by day, only to end up in an unmarked pit himself. The law showed no mercy. In 1524, a London grave robber was buried alive with his spoils, his muffled screams ignored as dirt rained down not just punishment, but a ritual cleansing, as if the earth itself could absorb the profanity. What's most haunting is how these executions blurred the line between justice and dark magic. By binding thieves to graves or interring them alive, medieval society wasn't just penalizing crime, it was performing an exorcism on the community's collective fear. The swinging cages and sealed tombs whispered a warning to the living. Some borders weren't meant to be crossed, and the dead would always have the last word. Yet for all the brutality, the graves kept being robbed, proving that hunger for gold, for knowledge, for survival, could outweigh even the terror of sharing a coffin with your sins. Looking back at these medieval punishments, what strikes us as shocking cruelty was, in its own time, a carefully crafted system of justice, one designed to uphold the pillars of society at any cost. Each brutal act, from the branding iron to the public pyre, wasn't just about inflicting pain. It was a mirror reflecting the era's deepest values. Order came first, not as an abstract ideal, but as a daily necessity in a world where chaos lurked just beyond the village walls. Religion wasn't merely personal faith, it was the glue binding communities together, a force so vital that heresy threatened the very fabric of existence. And hierarchy, that wasn't negotiable. The noble's life was worth 100 peasants, and the law made sure everyone remembered it. Yet there's a twisted logic to these punishments that modern viewers might overlook. The pillory didn't just humiliate a dishonest baker, it turned justice into a shared experience, reinforcing trust in a society without consumer protection agencies. A heretic's burning wasn't solely about punishment, it was a desperate attempt to purify the community, to ward off the divine retribution they believed would follow unrepentant sin. Even the spectacle of burying a kidnapper alive served a purpose. In an age without prisons or rehabilitation, deterrence had to be unforgettable. This raises an unsettling question: what blind spots exist in our own justice system? Future generations may look back at solitary confinement or lifelong debt from court fees with the same horrified fascination we reserve for medieval torture devices. Our concepts of fairness and cruelty are shaped by our moment in history, just as theirs were. The ducking stool and the stock market fine both serve the same fundamental purpose: to enforce the rules society can't function without. Perhaps the most enduring lesson isn't about the punishments themselves, but about human nature's stubborn consistency. We still crave order, still fear the outsider, still struggle to balance mercy and deterrence. The methods have changed, but the underlying tensions remain between individual rights and collective safety, between rehabilitation and retribution. If these stories have left you equal parts fascinated and unsettled, you're not alone. History's darkest corners hold up a mirror to our own world, reminding us how far we've come and how easily progress can unravel. Want to uncover more forgotten chapters where law and cruelty collide? Hit subscribe and join us as we keep digging into the past's most gripping, grotesque, and surprisingly revealing tales. After all, the strangest stories are often the ones that teach us the most, not just about them, but about ourselves.